It's my pleasure to introduce Lesley Rose Alway, who is a resident of Queenscliffe in the historic Fisherman's Flat. Lesley's career has focused on arts management, cultural policy and infrastructure. She is the chairperson of the Geelong Arts Centre that is currently undergoing a major redevelopment scheduled to open mid this year. In 2021, Lesley completed a Master of Urban and Cultural Heritage at the University of Melbourne, where she completed various research projects related to the architectural heritage in Queenscliffe and Geelong. She recently assisted the Queenscliffe Historical Museum volunteers in creating the inaugural exhibition, which is currently running now, Queenscliffe Revealed, Hidden Histories, New Narratives, for the gorgeous new museum at the Queenscliffe Hub. Lesley's previous roles include the Director of AsiaLink Arts, Managing Director of Sotheby's Australia, Director and CEO of Heidi Museum, and the Director of Arts Victoria. Lesley holds an MBA from Monash University, a BA Honours and Bachelor of Education from the University of Melbourne. It's our privilege to welcome Lesley Alway.
It's a delight to talk to you all here this morning about some of the research that I did as part of the Masters program I was doing. And as part of that, I did some research at the Queenscliffe Museum, Historical Museum. And I really pay tribute to Diana Sawyer and her team for their support in enabling me. I started just before COVID, and I think as I was starting, COVID happened, so we had lockdown. So a lot of the research has actually been done virtually, and I am interested to, get some feedback from many of you. I know there are longer term residents than myself of Queenscliffe. I lived through some of the things that I'll be talking about today, but if you've got any feedback or comments or queries or corrections, I'd really love to hear from them. So today I'm really going to talk about the post-war heritage of Queenscliffe, which is quite an interest of mine. And it's been stimulated by, I guess, a whole re-evaluation that heritage itself, both locally, nationally and internationally, has undergone over the last 20, 30 years really. Heritage, I guess, used to be seen to stop roughly about World War I. And people didn't really consider much of more contemporary building to be heritage. But a lot of work and research has been done, and particularly in Australia, some of you may be familiar by Professor Philip Goad from the University of Melbourne and Hannah Louis, who published this book a year or so ago called Australian Modern, where they did a really important major survey of Australian heritage buildings, public and private. And I think you've probably seen some of the debates play out in the media anyway, particularly around the heritage listing of suburban houses around in Melbourne, Beaumaris and Black Rock, etc., often a two-edged sword. But particularly the increased heritage listing of post-war buildings, including such famous ones as the ICI building, which was really the first skyscraper in Melbourne, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. So really my starting point was really, I guess, looking at some of the work that had been done to examine some of that modern heritage. And a comment that Philip Goad and Hannah Louis make in their book was Australians have finally come to love modern. But they actually have a caveat on that and say that was really about the sort of more important significant buildings. What they recognised in their research, but hadn't yet done the research, was that spare a thought for those modern buildings scattered throughout regional Australia, any one of the hundreds of post-war kindergartens, lawn bowls, clubs or local swimming pools that now find themselves obsolete and unloved. Many of these will vanish in the next decade. So for me, that really sparked some thinking about heritage and what happened in Queenscliffe after the war, or World War WW2. Now, as we know, we're very familiar when we talk about Queenscliffe heritage, and we often refer to, we can identify what we would normally classify as heritage. As you know, in Queenscliffe, there's uptown, and there was always downtown, which was a lot of downtown. We referred often to the Fisherman's Flat area, but had equal weighting in terms of the heritage significance for Queenscliffe. And obviously there are, examples such as the Queenscliffe Motel, the Main Street, Hesse Street, and then Fisherman's Flat and the little cottages. However, Queenscliffe did not stay the same. And sorry about the image that I had to download from the internet on this, but this is a shot of Queenscliffe in 1950. And 1950 is really the sort of taking off point, or the decade that I really look at in terms of post-war modernism for Queenscliffe. And many of you will recognise still some of the same shops and the scenes, the cars. Particularly just take note of that building on the left-hand side, which was the old CBC Bank that I will be talking about. So I really look at, and I'll just continue talking about the sort of change that happened. This was also roughly around the sort of 50s, and a comment that was in the paper which tried after the war to, I guess, take a fresh perspective on Queenscliffe and sort of say, well, maybe it could be a new Australian playground, the Florida Keys. As we know, Queenscliffe always had this reputation as an important resort town. But during the Depression and then the Second World War, lots had deteriorated, and it was really sort of suffering. But then after the war, post-war construction, there was a new vitality that was quite evident, and the government and business and private enterprise had to really start a whole reconstruction project. And that's where we had the influence of the technology from the war, American influence from the war, the advent of television, the motor car made a huge difference, as well as post-war migration from Europe. All of these things helped to change Australia and how Australians wanted to live. And Queenscliffe was not immune. And so in that decade of the 50s, there were some significant residential buildings, but also public buildings that were constructed during that decade. Some of you may recognise them, some may not. And these are the sort of case studies I'll be wanting to go through. So the buildings I want to be looking at are the Queenscliffe Higher Elementary School that then became the high school, the CBC Bank on the right, the middle one, the RSL, as many of you will know, as it is not now, but as was, the old Riptide Motel, and perhaps one of the more controversial was the additions to the town hall that of course are no longer there. If I have time, I'll also be looking at the residential building, the Dream House, that features in our exhibition at the new museum. In a way, this discussion about modernism and heritage in Queenscliffe is, in a sense, the tale of two Percys. And I often wonder what happened to Percy as a name. I've not heard of anyone called Percy for a long time, but back in the sort of, First World War, post, lots of people were called Percy. And there are two important Percys in Queenscliffe. And one of them was Percy Scott Williams. And I want to talk about Percy Scott Williams because, of course, the post-war modernism didn't just, land from a spaceship after the war in Queenscliffe. There were some precursors of modernist architecture in Queenscliffe that really paved the way so that after the Second World War, people were perhaps more receptive to contemporary design. And Percy Scott Williams, most of you will know or may know that he was the architect of Cottage by the Sea. But before he did Cottage by the Sea, he did these fabulous medical bars which were down on the foreshore, which we all wish that we still had. And I'm sorry about some of the quality of the images. As I said, I've had to source them. But you can see that Percy Scott Williams was very influenced by that sort of modern Art Deco style that had actually featured in Europe. Now, Percy was, I think, a bit of a war hero. He was an Air Force ace, and after the First World War, he trained as an architect because there were many schemes for servicemen. He went to Melbourne Uni, trained as an architect, but he did actually have strong links. He did actually have strong links to Queenscliffe through his sister-in-law, and I'll just find exactly the details. Her name was, let me just see, she had a holiday house on the corner of Jellybrand and Stoke Street that replaced a Victorian-era cottage, Linwood, and his sister-in-law was called Beatrice Miller. And you can see that's the corner of Stokes, and you see the Victorian cottage. He then built a new holiday home that I think at some stage, someone can correct me, became the Uniting Church Manse at some stage. And of course it's that sort of Tudor style house that you can see still existing. So Percy he was quite involved in Melbourne society. He does feature in certain Melbourne clubs, and obviously used to holiday at Queenscliffe, and through these links obviously got the gig to then do the medical bars. And these medical bars were really quite extraordinary, and I'll just sort of read some of them from the local press. They contained 8 rooms containing terrazzo-covered concrete hot and cold seawater slipper baths and freshwater showers, catering to those requiring, excuse my French, a douche and hydrotherapeutic treatment, hitherto unobtainable in Australia. So I guess the precursor to our modern day spas. It was originally, this building, meant to have 2 wings attached and also a glass top veranda with a roof on the top of it, which would have been, extraordinary. And I guess that added to that whole concept of Queenscliffe as a haven for bathing and resort and respite. So they were, I guess, built in the mid-30s. Robin Boyd had declared in 1934 as the year of revolution in architecture. And as if on cue, the then Mayor, Councillor Lewis Klug, I understand it's pronounced, laid the foundation stone for these medical bars in July 1935. We must be coming up to some sort of anniversary for these. And this was likely the first real modernist building in the borough. Unfortunately, they sort of fell into disrepair, obviously, after the war. I think there were, ideas that it might become a courthouse at one stage, but eventually it was demolished in the 50s. I think the army might have blown it up or something, from what I gathered. But Percy, just to talk a little bit more, about his career, he did actually work for the Commonwealth, drawing office based in Victoria, worked with John Smith Murdoch, who was very senior in Canberra in the setting up of Canberra with Walter Billy Griffin, and he actually had some designs, selected and illustrated and published, I found. He got second prize or something, I think, with someone else for a design for the Canberra War Memorial. And I think there was also another one, which I haven't put up there, for one of the first administrative buildings. So he was quite, at the time, a well-respected architect. He also designed in South Yarra his own sort of duplex home that I think is still standing as small flats or apartments. He then was given the commission, following this, to design Cottage by the Sea. And this was an illustration that was actually published, I think, in the Argus, giving some sense of the design. And it's interesting, Percy's designs were, I think, often illustrated because he was also, I found out, an etcher, a printmaker. And so he had a very beautiful drawing style that lended itself, I think, to illustration. So, Cottage by the Sea, many of you will be familiar with the story, I don't need to go over it. A respite place for children and run by the Ministering Children's League. And the new Cottage by the Sea from the 30s replaced, of course, this original Queen Anne sort of Federation-style building, quite beautiful, by well-known architect, Melbourne architect Beverly Usher. So you can see Queenscliffe's had some really named architects, work in its precinct. And whatever happened to Beverly as a man's name as well? So I think it's actually a Welsh name. So this was actually the original Cottage by the Sea. It was deemed as unsuitable, I guess, during the 30s, because it was like 40 years old, and so it was demolished. And then they built, and it was virtually not long after it was built. So it was finished, I think, in that sort of about 1938. There was a poliomyelitis epidemic, and so it was handed over to, I guess, for the medical facilities to treat people with polio, infantile polio. And then, unfortunately, the outbreak of the war in 1939, and it was handed over to the Red Cross as a hospital for injured returning servicemen. So it never really got to be Cottage by the Sea until after the war, until the mid-40s, in terms of as we know it today. And of course, it's just undergone a massive redevelopment, and with making use of those views that look out to the sea. When you read some of the descriptions of this building, they actually didn't position the children's wings to the south so they could look to the views. They were actually built to the north, facing inland. And it was more because the northern light was seen to be more important and for the children and the children's health, rather than to looking out to sea. I was lucky enough to get a tour of that building as they were doing a lot of demolition, so I was able to actually see some of the actual original fabric of the building and document it and take some photographs of it. The local description, I'll just read briefly, was quite interesting. It was light concrete walls and blue paint, and an interior scheme of cheerful primrose and green. And as I said, the design of the two upper dormitories faced north to capture the sun. Lady Huntingfield opened the new building, and her comments, a real comment about how particularly, I guess, in the 30s and post-war, there was a great investment in the health and development of children at that time. She said, the greatest riches and this building would enable many children to have the best possible chance in life to develop their physique and bring every little citizen to his or her highest pitch of development. So, I guess this was an important building, but then after World War II, it became clear that modernism was really truly accepted as the main building style. Now, I want to go on to Queenscliffe High School, was high elementary school. Hands up those here who went to. Anyone go to the school?
I taught there.
Oh, wow. You may be in one of the photos. And this was really interesting project because I used to live around just the corner in King Street. Was familiar with the old high school before it was actually demolished. But also, I guess, growing up I'm a child of the 50s, and seeing a lot of these sorts of schools going up in the suburbs, and I'm sure many of you did. Hands up those who went to a school like this, but not in Queenscliff. Okay. Does anyone know what that was called?
LTC.
Yes, and what did LTC stand for?
I built many of them.
Oh, are you related to Jennings?
No, we
Oh, right. Because I think Jennings did do some of the construction. What does LTC stand for?
Light timber construction.
That's right. Well done. And in fact, it's really interesting because this was a really new post-war innovation, and Queenscliffe actually received one of the first, am I right? One of the first was 1954 when this was built. Did you build any before that?
No.
No. Good.
We took over from Jennings.
Yeah.
And we built additions to the
Yes.
school, and we built the gym sports
Yes.
thing.
Yeah. Great.
But it was in the 60s.
Yes. So the interesting thing, and many of you will know the high school site, and I think the Modens owned the land. And I did, when I could after COVID, get into the Public Record Office where they have some really interesting files on the high school that I don't think have been really exposed very much before. There were long negotiations between the Modens for acquiring the land to build the high school. And the decision was actually made in 1946 that there would be a new school, because before that it was in the St George's Hall, of course. And the then headmaster, Mr Hood, did anyone know Mr Hood from 19... Hood? Some other interesting things about Mr Hood. So he wrote to the town clerk of the Borough of Queenscliffe and he said, "Dear sir," this is 1946, "the teachers and pupils of this school have been given to understand that the site for the new school has been approved by the Lands Department. Although it may be some time before their new school is erected, we feel that it would be a good idea to plan and put in the trees necessary as a background to a fine school on behalf of the teachers and children." That was 1946. They did not actually move in until another 8 years. It took 8 years. But when I was going through the file at Public Record Office, it became clear to me that they actually had started, the Education Department of Lands had actually started planning. So in the 50s, there had actually been a scheme drawn up by the other Percy Edgar Everett, who was then the Chief Architect of the Public Works Department, and quite famous for many of the buildings, hospitals, schools, university buildings that people would be familiar with. But this is the opening of the first phase of, I guess, the first construction in 1954. And particularly of note are those skylight type windows at the top, and the first group of teachers proudly standing outside. And just to go back to Percy Edgar Everett, who was actually had a long association with Geelong. He had worked for the Buck and Laird architecture company. They did a lot of famous Geelong buildings, still going as Buck and Group, including buildings at the Gordon, Percy Edgar Everett designed, and as well as, I think, the rotunda in Johnson Park, the memorial rotunda there that many of you will be familiar with, and also the original state government offices that is next, which I know well, which is on the corner of Little Mallup and, I'll say, Geringham Street, or Geringham Street, which is now Platform Arts, or an arts centre. So that was the original state government offices and courthouse there. And Percy designed that, and if you remember, it's sort of more Mediterranean type deco style building. Then you have the old GPAC, we're now redeveloping, Geelong Arts Centre, then the new state offices, which is known as the upside down building on the other corner. So Percy had a really strong influence in Geelong, and perhaps because of that local association. So Percy, and just to give you an idea, he also designed a lot of the buildings associated with schools and in University of Melbourne, that including the Tate building. And then I found this plan in the file where in about 50 he'd actually drawn up a plan for what he called the future school at Queenscliffe. And you can see on that end, you can see that curve, that sort of semicircle, and it was very deco type building. So this was the original. It was quite, this was only one level, it was a multi-level building, but in the style of really what that Tate building was. So Queenscliffe was actually originally destined to have quite a different sort of building. And that was then translated into more detailed plans, and you can see by they, even in those days, their public works department outsourced. So they outsourced to architecture company Fredman Ord, who translated it into those plans. However, it was never actually built, which is interesting. So instead, they built, I guess, what I showed you before in 1954, and as this gentleman has explained, it was then extended during the 60s. And these are some interesting, I guess, shots. Is this the one that you built in the 60s? Is this the one that you built in the 60s?
We built additions to it, and
yes.
we built the sports hall, but that would be in the 70s.
Yes. So, and this is the wife of Headmaster Bishop, who I think is Colin Bishop's father, was Colin Bishop's father, who was the headmaster, and she had found a snake. So this photo, so she's flinging the snake, and you can see the construction of the building, and then you can see the masonry. So over time, originally there were the vertical wooden or whatever panels, and then eventually masonry, additions. And there's a very rare interior shot which we have, which was published in the newspaper, and that was really a story about Benito's treasure, because just down below, because they were, I guess, dynamiting to look for Benito's treasure, and as the school opened, all of this sort of debris was raining in on these poor students, and someone did say they recognised themselves in that. You can sort of see the crane of Benito's treasure outdoors, but for me what is really interesting is it actually, it's a bit chopped off, but at the top you can see they have these open, in the original photo, open sort of skylighty windows that allowed air and light to sort of flow through. And it was a very different style of school building to, of course, those, many of us, grew up going to those dark, red brick, dungeony type buildings for our education. And this was very much championed by Robin Boyd, who didn't really like Percy Everett because of that sort of deco, but he actually really applauded publicly the contributions that Everett made, particularly the sort of modularisation, the lightness, the ease of construction and the modern design. Now, the reason that they went into the LTC construction was really about the post-war baby boom, and particularly because of the need for more high schools, and they had to roll out these, schools pretty quickly as people were settling in the outer suburbs. And I just found it fascinating that Queenscliffe was really one of the first and the pioneers of the LTC system from schools. Now, of course, sadly, over the years they did deteriorate because, of course, they don't necessarily put money into maintenance of school facilities, and as they had to roll out more schools in other areas, and eventually this was demolished when the Queenscliffe High Elementary School, or high school, I guess Ballerine College was established. It was then ultimately demolished and most of the land sold off for, as we know, private development. Now, my next case study is Commercial Bank of Sydney. And this is really interesting because this building is designed, as you'll see, by Bates Smart McCutcheon, one of the most well-known architecture firms in Australia. And of course has an important heritage because one of the originators of the Bates Smart McCutcheon firm was another really famous architect associated with Queenscliffe. Does anyone know who that was? Reed. Yeah, Joseph Reed. Joseph Reed was the architect of the Queenscliffe Hotel, but also he designed the State Library, the Royal Exhibition Buildings, Geelong Town Hall, Melbourne Town Hall. I could go on and on, even as a young man. And so he, I guess, was one of the originators of this company, Bates Smart, who still operating, in a different form today. So that building on the left, you'll see that's the 50s, which I was really surprised to find out was that we actually had a BSM building in Queenscliffe. And of course the banks post-war were really also at the forefront of modern design because they were, I guess, the generators of supporting, private housing development, new businesses, and they were in their own bank designs, keen to showcase you know, the sort of modern, forward-thinking progress. That was the old building, that sort of, you know, Victorian colonial type building that was built in the late 19th century that you saw on that first photo that occupied the same site. And a lot of competition, really. I think at the time, Queenscliffe had about 2,500 people, population, but there was like 3 or 4 banks, you know, vying for attention, unlike today, you know, in Queenscliffe. And so they all wanted to move up into, you know, the main street. And so CBC, then Commercial Bank Company in Sydney, then commissioned Bates Smart McCutcheon to build a new bank in that mid-50s period. And I was lucky enough, the banks often have really fantastic archives. And I think the inheritor of CBC Bank, I think from memory, is NAB. And I have to say, NAB were fantastic. They have archivists. Because it was COVID, it was difficult, but eventually the archivist was able to give me the whole specification for the building of this bank, original photos, the written and even the building contract for it, which is really exciting, I think, to have and really reveal this sort of unknown history of Queenscliffe. So that's some of the original photos. It was not only a bank, but of course they also had the manager live in residence in those days. And locally, it was really applauded. And I think the Queenscliffe Pilot said in 1955, the erection of the present fine modern bank building by a company in Hesse Street, Queenscliffe, indicates the confidence in the future progress and prosperity of Queenscliffe and the surrounding district. So it was all really, you know, upbeat and positive. And the pilot described in detail its modern facilities and decoration, noting the office interior of polished Queensland maple, must be gorgeous, and special acoustic asphalt squared flooring, as well as the built-in furniture and terrazzo flooring in the residence. Drapes and carpets were supplied by Brighton Hitchcock's Geelong, very famously, and also in Queenscliffe. And the architect specified a bright contemporary colour scheme of april green, lotus pink, Arctic sky and primrose, all of which I think from the 50s you would recognise from your own house. And interestingly enough, what I found was that it was originally that apricot brick. At the same time as they were designing and building, Bates Smart McCutcheon were rebuilding Wilson Hall at University of Melbourne. So there is this correspondence in timing and also that colour of the bricks, and that one on the left is CBC, always had different logo, you know, changes of thing, but that was I think from about 1980. I actually remember, I can remember that building. But that's a picture of Wilson Hall. It's using those bricks, but also that glass curtain wall, which they also did ICI House, and that was, you know, where you start to get that whole skyscraper influence. Interestingly enough, I found also in the University of Melbourne archives, which holds a lot of architectural archives, some other 2 sketches that are called Plans for the Queenscliffe Bank from CBC Bank. And when I was just looking up the index and said, oh, this is exciting, and I expected to get the plans or drawings from that other bank that, you know, we saw, the apricot cream, this is actually what they sent me. So it appears to me, this is 53, now it's a bit of a mystery because there isn't much information, I need to get back in there, that perhaps there were plans to build even a more radically designed modern bank on that site, or I guess the sleeper in the pack in this is they're actually referring to Queenscliffe in Sydney. But it does say Queenscliffe, Melbourne, and it is in, you know, the University of Melbourne. So it is something I need to follow up, but it is possible that this perhaps just proved too radical for the good citizens of Queenscliffe, and they then reverted to perhaps a more conservative, modern style. And of course, this is it today. So this is a really interesting example of, I guess, the heritage debates and issues that I had. You can see it's been rendered, and of course they've attached a veranda. And I know that many people in the 80s and even the newspapers applauded, oh, it's fantastic, you know, heritage is coming back into Queenscliffe and verandas are going up. That was in the newspaper. Well, actually in this case, you can see that's totally inappropriate. It was never meant to have a veranda. And it's, of course, it's now, I think, back to Airbnb or whatever. And I have snuck around the back, and it sort of still looks, you know, I haven't been inside. Some of you may have. But, in fact, most people would know that this was actually a really significant building from, you know, socially and of its time and architecturally. Now, I want to go on to, most of you will know, the Riptide Motel, which was built in 1956, the year of the Olympics. The builder only Britain, and of course very familiar to many, you know, all of us who used to drive past. And of course this was immortalised by Vance Joy, the popular singer. I would have liked to have played the Riptide song, but there's such copyright restrictions now. It's really quite difficult, but you can just go onto Google if you don't know it, and, or was it YouTube, and download YouTube and download Riptide. I think I've gotten, that's just some of the words, because Vance Joy used to holiday at the Riptide Motel. He lived in Kew, I think, but as a teenager and a young boy, and immortalised Riptide Motel. So Vance Joy is pretty famous, and so is the Riptide Motel pretty famous as well. So this is another really interesting case, and the Riptide Motel units, the first ones were really built and opened. It was, I think, Riptide Holiday Flats and Motel. And it was actually an initiative of the then licensee of what's now the Esplanade Hotel, Jack Williams, who obviously people used to stay, you know, at the Esplanade Hotel. His brother-in-law, I think, was the Ernie Britton, and they recognised, particularly Jack Williams, that people didn't want to stay in the guest houses or hotels with shared bathrooms and, you know, communal fun down in the evenings anymore. The motor car had changed that. You know, American sort of images of what people did in America really sort of changed that. And families wanted to stay in like more individual units. They wanted to travel around, have more independence. So they decided to build a new complex on Flinders Street. So they actually built what was then, what was Upton House, which was, I guess, another, you know, rest home, but for destitute gentlewomen. I think also run by Geelong Benevolent Ladies Society. And that Upton House, someone said it may have actually been transported from elsewhere to there. I'm unsure about that, but a sort of classic Victorian, you know, country homestead house. And you can see it. You can see the units that have been built on the left. You can see the image of Upton House. They actually didn't demolish it to actually build the units. Well, not initially. What they did, the family lived in Upton House and then actually utilised a lot of the materials to actually build the first units around the perimeter. And this is an amazing example, I think, of Queenscliffe and what I call the Queenscliffe vernacular style, where lots of things get recycled and reused, you know, and very efficiently. Started really down at Fisherman's Flat. And they sort of reinvented, so a lot of the fabric of Upton House was actually incorporated into those first and initial units of the Riptide Motel. Now, if you actually have a look at the interior, incredibly modern, and check those Marcel Brewer chairs, you know, that's incredible. And the lino floor, the check lino floor, and built in on the right, you see built-in furniture. It looks like the most beautiful cabinetry, Queensland maple or something. The wardrobe, the Chanel bedspread, you know, so really very modern and very, very popular. Now, the story is that this was the second motel built in Victoria, although it's not really documented in any of the sort of histories of motel. And believe me, there's a whole lot of literature about the history of the motel, internationally, America and in Australia. And in fact, The first motel, does anyone know, is it what up there? Yeah, Oakley. The first motel in Victoria was seen to be, and is documented in the heritage, the Oakley Motel, which is on Prince's Highway or Dandenong Road, coming into Melbourne. And in fact, that was actually heritage listed not that long ago, 20 or so years ago, but ultimately the developers got in, didn't make any difference, and I think it's pretty well subsequently been demolished. But the Oakley Hotel actually didn't really open, I think, till 1957. So in fact, the whole of the Queenscliffe holiday flats and motel were actually before that. But I think because perhaps they were called holiday flats, perhaps because of a little bit, out in the regions, people weren't that aware of it. But you can sort of see the same stylistic, the butterfly roof, that sort of, the white wooden, paned windows, that sort of more stark modernist feature. But really, Queenscliffe was pretty, it's pretty impressive that we had one of the first, motels in Victoria. I am conscious of time, but I do want to also talk about the RSL building. A little bit of a tragedy, I think. See, this is almost the ultimate in modernist, style. This incredible coloured glass window wall, I remember it from when I first used to come to Queenscliffe, with this stained glass, was built by, and the builder was James O'Byrne, built in 1957. Now, James O'Byrne had been a returned soldier in the Second World War. I think he was president of the RSL for a couple of years, and obviously took charge of the building. Could not find documents on whether he was working to architect's plans or his own design, but I suspect, given this, it was perhaps architecturally designed. Now, just quickly, he also built his own building, which of course just been some renovations have happened on Flinders Street. That was his house. See, quite starkly modern as well. And that's what it was when it was open. And the research though shows that in fact it wasn't a whole new building that was open, a bit like in the recycling of Upton House. What they did, it's really just a facade, and you can see that sort of two-storey facade on the back of then what was the original 1920s Memorial Hall that was designed by Mr. Ghazali, who was a city engineer at the time. You can see it a bit easier there. You see the very sort of dark, foreboding Memorial Hall that was built in the 20s. But of course that wasn't even really the first on the site. Many of you will know that the old YMCA hut was built just at the end, I think, of the First World War, 1918 or so, to supply support for returned servicemen. They could play billiards and go and have something to eat. Then after the war, people wanted to memorialise, I guess, the fallen. It had been such a drastic, tragic sort of time. And so what they did, though, in true Queenscliffe style, was, banged it on a tractor, trucked it down Hesse Street, and it ended up on the corner, the end of Hesse Street, corner, help me out, Rosemary.
Simon Street.
Yeah, Simon Street and Hesse Street. Yeah. I think it became a billiard hall, ended up, I think, as a Freeze clothing factory for a while in that. So another great example of recycling Queenscliffe heritage. But of course then, the new hall, which was incredibly popular for dances and singing and concerts, and there's lots, we've got, photos in the museum, of it. But I think in the just late 80s, early 90s, I think the maintenance of that wall with the coloured glass seemed to become too much, and so it was actually then subsequently bricked over, which we have today. But if you check the Facebook page on, Queenscliffe, Point Lonsdale, Young and Old, or whatever it's called, there's lots of comments when they put pictures up about people, mourning the loss of that, beautiful facade. And really, it was like, a Mondrian or de Stijl, painting from modern, and incredibly radical for Queenscliffe, to have that. and are quite significant. There was a lot of debate at the time after the Second World War about what you should do to memorialise the fallen, rather than having just sort of statues that you see in many country towns. There was a big push to have things like community halls that were perhaps more useful, and I think that's how this came about. That, you know, demolished that old, you know, Kazali red brick thing or the front of it, and then build a new sort of structure that could be useful. And if you go into the hall today, you can still see the old rear structure at the interior of the rear. This is perhaps one of the most controversial, particularly during all my time at Queenscliffe, so it was removed. And this was the municipal offices that was built at the end of this decade, 1959-60. Hands up those who remember these offices. And what was one of the most, I guess, starkly modernist features of this building? Can anyone tell me?
Tiles.
Yes, the tiles. What colour were they, Rosemary?
Blue.
The bright blue. Right, beautiful. I'm sure they were beautiful tiles that were along that sort of right-hand side before the planter boxes. And at the time, this was hailed as, oh, thank God, Queenscliffe's getting into progress. You know, there were moves in the newspapers to get new municipal council offices, right from early, you know, I think from 1950, the council, though, you read the pilot and whatever newspaper, they had to take loans out to, you know, to afford these additions. The history of, you know, other people, you see there's a whole history to the town hall. Started off as Forester's Hall. I'm sure Bill and Rosemary will correct me if I get any of this wrong. Designed by Joseph Watts, the famous Geelong architect. And then, well, he rebuilt around, I think, the original Forester's Hall. And it had this portico on the front. So there was the hall, then the portico, but really there wasn't room for the council staff or, you know, administration or meetings or anything. And so you can see one of the original shots with that portico, and then you can see the demolition of that portico actually happening in the 50s there. And so the borough commissioned an architect called Robert Canterbury, who was obviously English architect because he was a member of the British Royal Institute of Architects. And when I was going through some of the plan draws, courtesy of Diana and her team, we actually have the original plans for these extensions to the town hall by Robert Canterbury, the original drawings in the plan draw, which is quite, you know, interesting. You know, architecture heritage buffs love to see the original plans. And I've just, you know, it was hard to, you know, reproduce, but, you know, had things like formica tops. Well, you know, that was such a modern thing, you know, a formica top. But he also designed the furniture. You can see that, you know, mid-century modern furniture, that would be worth a fortune these days. Beautifully designed. You can see the desk, you know, the chairs, the stool. So very, very modernist. And it was hailed at the time as, you know, remodelling the municipal hall on modern lines. And there was rejoicing at Queenscliffe yesterday that the borough has at last got a suite of municipal offices and a council chamber befitting one of the leading seaside resorts of the state. Now, interestingly enough, right at the start, before they were doing this in the mid-50s, I also found in the archives at the Historical Museum, and this is why they're so valuable, I think the newsletters from the local sort of Queenscliffe, you know, Women's Association. And they had written this very witty ditty about the town hall. And I'll just give you a flavour of it. The council has outgrown our own little town hall. So now they're going to extend to make room for them all. The younger set did fight with our councillors, 'tis true, but now the extensions are in sight, there'll be room for them here too. The chorus goes, oh, they're building here and digging there to make this old town gay. Oh, what fun it is to watch work in this town today. So there was a whole commentary about the building of this new town hall. And from, I guess, the early days where it was hailed as, you know, such progress, the Minister for Local Government came down and this is Queenscliffe going into modernisation. I guess a lot of people then, particularly during that sort of heritage renaissance of the 70s and 80s, poor old Robert Canterbury's extension, I think, were one of the key targets of, I guess, disappointment about, and I think it was because they were added to, this is the later edition, added to the outside of that important hall, more functional. So eventually the council decided to demolish those 60s extension, and I think there was probably dancing in the street perhaps when that happened, but without people necessarily realising perhaps at the time the significance of those original modern extensions in terms of charting that progress in Queenscliffe. And then they commissioned McGlashan Everest, well-known Geelong architecture firm, and from our Heidi days, architects of the original, of the Heidi 2 building, to design perhaps a more sympathetic extension that we have here today. And I took that photo. You can see a beautiful sunset at Queenscliffe during mid-lockdown or something, I think. Getting there. Then I did also want to then touch on the dream house, and partly because of, you know, it's such an interesting story, I think, and very fascinating. Because as we talk about in the exhibition in the hub, that this was very much associated with their great grand event of the filming of The End of the World, with the director Stanley Kramer and the well-known actor and actresses whose names are just escaping. Ava Gardner, yeah, and Gregory Peck, of course. Often I call Stanley Kramer Stanley Kubrick, you know, to get the Stanleys, you know, mixed up. But in the press, I guess it was such a big event for Queenscliffe, although it is debatable. I'm not sure that much of Queenscliffe actually ended up in the film. I think it was mainly Frankston's, the Frankston scenes, and I think a lot of the Queenscliffe scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. But they were keen to use the sort of, you know, celebrities when they were here. So it was reported in the paper around this time, Queenscliffe will be used in certain scenes in the filming of Neville Shute's book On the Beach. The American producer Stanley Kramer announced this yesterday when he opened the Point Lonsdale Dream House. Mr. Kramer told a large crowd that he hoped the film would make a small contribution to the peace of the world, because it was all about, you know, the end of the world, and we all know Ava Gardner's, you know, famous quote. Perfectly filmed. But apparently the film wasn't very well received when I read later, and actually didn't do well at the box office. But I know Acme, I think, in Melbourne, had a bit of an anniversary not long ago, played the film, and I think I'm sure you can download it off, you know, one of those sites, anyway, if you want to watch it. And the book, I think, in fact, someone's donated a copy of the book,
Conley donated the copy that Mieter O'Donnell gave to her mother as a youngster, Maria McDonald, and we have the original copy of, and it's signed by Mieter in the front finally. It's on exhibition.
Which is, you know, a lovely thing to have. And interesting how all these are connected. So when Stanley Kramer launches this dream house, which was being built and raffled off, as they did for, I think, the Queenscliffe Community Hospital at the time. And it was reported that there were like thousands of people, and it was the corner of Fellows and Pentland Road in Point Lonsdale. But I think from reading the newspaper reports, most people were there, they didn't know who Stanley Kramer was, but they knew who Bert Newton was, and Arlene Andrewartha, who, if you Google, who used to be an offsider, they were there to see them. So huge drawing up. So this was then raffled off. And I think also the interesting thing is some of the other prizes. It was incredible. So I think there was a Gogglebmobile, if you remember. There was a television, you know, the whole new television thing that actually, you know, came about. Interesting, and only more recently have I found out that the designer of this house was the very same Robert Canterbury that designed the extensions to the the Queenscliffe Town Hall. And the reason how I found out was, I don't know, sometimes you just like, you know, surf, Google around, and I must have been Googling or something on to see is there any more info on the Facebook side about this house. And what came up on Twitter, and I'm not in Twitter, so it was hard for me to access, was someone had put up the original plans of this house on the Twitter site, and I could actually see the plans were by Robert Canterbury. So he was obviously around at that time. I haven't been able to find much information about him. If anyone knows, I'd be love to see. But there is a bit of an interesting history with the house because it actually relates, I mean, the time, this was like 59, and it was sort of based a bit on the Rose Seidler house, you know, in Sydney. That was built in the previous, you know, decade by Harry Seidler. But it's often aligned to, Lend-Lease did a whole series of houses called the Beachcomber. And the Beachcomber houses in Sydney in particular, like it has its own website. It's like it's a cult thing, these Beachcomber houses. And they were designed by one of the Lend-Lease architects, I think might have been Italian at the time. But actually that wasn't, the first one wasn't actually built or designed till early 60s. So it's interesting that the Queenscliffe one predated that. So once again, Queenscliffe is at the forefront of this modernist, you know, design. But also around the same time, the bottom right-hand side house was designed by another well-known, at that time, Sir Bernard Evans, architect, and it was built on St Kilda Road, and it was being raffled, I think, for the Royal Women's Hospital. Mm-hmm. So this was a thing at the time, but you can see the correspondences. And that's the plans that actually, somehow, I don't know how I did it, got them off Twitter, of Robert Canterbury's original designs for that house. Sadly, that house has been demolished now, so that's life. But actually, it was sort of happening around the COVID period, and I managed to go onto, and I'm not IT savvy, but onto Google Maps or whatever, hone in, and actually just take this shot of, because it had been demolished when I went to look for it on the site, but of course they hadn't updated the Google Maps thing. So I was actually able to download what eventually that house, before it was demolished, actually looked like. So that was our very famous, I guess, modernist design from a domestic building point of view. There is another one, if you drive down Ballerine Highway, as you come down the hill, Leopold, that new estate on the left-hand side, if you look carefully, there is one that's built, it's on an angle, and looks to me quite original. So, and you do see them around, the number built on, Mornington Peninsula in particular, these sorts of houses, Rye, Blair, Gary. Right, I think I'm probably getting the wind up now. So I guess that was just, I wanted to just give you a little bit of a, tour through those case studies. Hopefully you've learned something new. And whilst, I guess, what we can see is that a lot of that modernist heritage has been erased or destroyed, a lot of the social significance, particularly about post-war Queenscliffe, really remains, and that you can see really that Queenscliffe played a really important role in the sort of modernist design history of the whole of Victoria and in fact of Australia, just in terms of those particular public buildings that were constructed at the time. I guess the postscript to that is really a lot of these were demolished or changed, during that 70s and 80s wave, which, was the Heritage Renaissance wave when Patricia came down, to renovate the Queenscliffe Hotel, and people, in Victoria, the inner suburbs rediscovered Victoriana. And so that's what was seen to be heritage. Did up all their terrace houses, but in fact that doing that often destroyed some of the other, at the time, didn't realise was perhaps heritage. I guess the other postscript is that Queenscliffe also has some significant contemporary buildings as well. And I think we need to perhaps learn some of the lessons from this post-war phase, and I refer in particular to the pilot station building that was Denton Corker Marshall's first public commission building that's down on that foreshore, and DCM just celebrated their 50th anniversary as an architectural practice, very important. We have, of course, the Pole House, we have that other Gasworks house, so there's some more work to be done on Queenscliffe in terms of contemporary buildings and contemporary heritage. Thanks everyone for your attention.